That's going to take some time to kick in. Ignore the fact that I'm drugging myself for this podcast. It is of my own free will. I'm not coerced to do this anyway, by the way. I'm not doing this for like a job or for money or anything. I like it. I'm doing it because I enjoy it. And because I think this is useful information that should be disseminated. But anyway, now we've got the background out of the way. We've got 40 minutes of background and names out of the way. Now let's talk about what communism actually is. In an episode titled What Actually Is Communism, we're just getting to it now. Fuck me. Right. Using the three ideological components that we talked about earlier of politics, economics, and socio-cultural views. Let's talk about economics. And indeed, when we talk about the economic nature of communism, communism is in fact its own economic system. It makes sense to describe communism a communist economic system. So the economic system of communism is when, in a sentence, the economic system that is communism is when the means of production and distribution are commonly owned. Let's talk about what the fuck that means. And you've probably heard the term means of production before. Means of production is not like a Marxist term. It's just a term in economics. And the means of production is basically how stuff gets made. So we can think of the means of production as labor, i.e. people working, because labor is needed to make stuff. The instruments of labor, so tools, machinery, factories, infrastructure, even stuff like restaurants or buildings, and subjects of labor, natural resources and raw materials. And what happens is that goods, i.e. things, are made with labor acting on the subjects of labor using the instruments of labor. So, for example, we have a worker in a factory manipulating natural resources in such a way that creates a good. Another way of defining the means of production is by talking about the three factors of production. And the three factors of production are land, labor, and capital. And capital is just stuff. It's just resources. And capital here includes capital goods. Now, capital goods are things which are used to make consumer goods. Consumer goods is stuff that we just have. So your furniture, your lamp, your clothes, your toothbrush, these are consumer goods. Capital goods is stuff like machinery. It's stuff that you're not really owning for shits and giggles. It's stuff that you own to make consumer goods, to make things. Now, in a knowledge economy such as the one we have now, the means of production can also be learning, it can be research, it can be knowledge, it can be education, innovation, ideas. And colloquially, when we talk about the means of production, we often include the means of distribution, but in fact, the means of distribution are separate. The means of distribution is how stuff that is made gets moved around, gets given to people. So storefronts, for example, a store is a means of distribution. When you go to your Tesco Express, that Tesco Express is a means of distribution. Now, stores and buildings can also be means of production when they're used to make stuff. So, for example, the bakery in the big Tesco's is, I guess, a means of production. But it can be a means of distribution as well. And infrastructure, the internet, all these are means of distribution. Now, in communism is a system where the means of production and the means of distribution are communally owned. And this is the difference between socialism. See, in socialism, these are socially owned. So these are owned by the people working in them. People get what they are owed, to each according to his deeds. Whereas communism is to each according to his needs. Needs here are self-determined. Now, basically this means that there is a communal ownership of all the means of production. There's a communal stockpile of stuff, and people can take from that stockpile as they will. Now, you might be thinking that's not a good idea because people are greedy and they will take stuff. Perhaps you're right. And in fact, greed is in fact an innate psychological capacity. Whereas Karl Marx argued that the emotion of greed was fashioned as a consequence. It's implanted in humans by living in the economic system of capitalism. It's not innate. We do actually know now that greed is innate. We can talk about the evolutionary psychology of greed. I may even do that in a future episode. It's not the case now. But again, I'm not trying to tell you at this stage whether all this is going to work or not. I'm just saying what it is. Now, commonly owned is when everyone in that society owns that thing. It's owned indivisibly by everyone. An example of this in our society is open source software or public domain works. Everyone owns it. Now, socially owned enterprise may be a transitional necessity, but it's not the end goal. And the idea in communism that things are made, the whole point of making stuff is not profit and the accumulation of capital. They are not designed to enrich people. It's for social goals. That social goal can be anything that a society defines. It could be the goal to eliminate homelessness. It could be the goal to give everyone a decent standard of living. The point is that in a communist society, stuff is made not to make people richer, but to make society happier. That is the point. It's for communal and not self-interest. And the idea behind this was that capitalism leads to economic inequality. It leads to exploitation of people by other people. It leads to injustice. Basically, it leads to negative social results. So a society in which you live crammed in a room with 5 people in a bed, which, by the way, is actually what happened in the early stage of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, and everyone around you is dying of cholera because you're living in such shitty conditions. By the way, actually what happened. Then you go to work, you work for 16 hours a day. This is actually what happened. You lose your arm in a machine, which happened all the time, and you just die in the streets because now you can't work and there's no compensation. Again, this all actually happened. The idea is that in these capitalistic enterprises seeking profit, they are neglecting social goods. And communism is fundamentally conceptualized. The political science definition of communism, as conceptualized in the 1800s, is a way of improving people's quality of life. And and the whole point is that capitalism leads to power imbalances. There is a power imbalance between a factory owner and a worker. Because that factory worker needs to live. They need to survive. Whereas that factory owner doesn't need the worker at all. So, and obviously if workers group up together and form a big union, that redresses that power imbalance. But between two individuals in a capitalist society, there is a massive power imbalance. And communism is fundamentally designed to neutralize that power imbalance and to make sure that all people are equal. Communism fundamentally rejects any form of hierarchy and any form of authoritarianism. This is an early hint to differences between communism as devised and communism as implemented. Now, in communism, there is no such thing as private property, but there is personal property. You're allowed to own things for your own. You're allowed to own your own clothes. You're allowed to own, like, a desk lamp or a chair or a toothbrush. So there's this Thatcher quote where she says, like, oh, in a socialist society, you won't be able to own your own toothbrush. That's not what socialism is. That is all that is showing that Thatcher is someone who viciously condemns socialism without a real understanding of what it is. You're allowed to own personal property because private property and personal property, by the way, are just economic definitions. They're not Marxist terms. Private property is when you own things that are needed to make things. So ownership of land or the means of production. Private property is property that is a means of production. So owning a factory, owning a coal yard, owning the railways, that is private property because all these things are needed to make things and distribute things. Owning capital goods is private property. Owning consumer goods is personal property. Now, the idea in communism is that eventually there's no need for money or a state or a central authority at all because these are elements of coercion, hierarchy, and inequality. Money, if some people have more money than others, then some people are better off than others, which means that people aren't equal. You have inequality and you have a form of economic hierarchy. And the state, by maintaining that order, by acting as a force of coercion, is therefore forcing you, the idea of a state in communist thinking is that it is an element of coercion. Now, again, in the abstract, you might be like, in practice at the time, this is very much what was going on. Because in the 1800s, states did horrific things all the time. States committed genocide. Britain committed genocide in Tasmania. Germany committed it in East Africa. America arguably committed it with the Native Americans. States also oppressed the shit out of their citizens all the time. So, for example, in the kind of a few years after the Napoleonic Wars in Britain, for example, lots of repression from the state. An example is 1819, a massacre in St. Peter's Fields where a bunch of people were like peacefully protesting, saying, hey, can you give us democracy? And the government was like, that's cool. I am going to send cavalrymen with swords to just kill all of you. And that's what happened. Well, specifically, it was the local government who did that. But the central government basically just said, yeah, good job. Cheers. So again, none of this stuff is abstract. When these communist thinkers said a state is an element of coercion, it very much was at the time. It still kind of is now. I mean, you can see the heavy-handed way with which Western states treat protesters, for example. So that hasn't really changed. The point is that this isn't an abstract ideal. Coercion was most definitely happening at the time, and it's most definitely happening now. And in the economic system of communism, there's no profit motive. People don't make things in order to get richer as individuals. They make things for the good of society. There's also no such thing as capital accumulation. An individual cannot accumulate capital. They cannot build up and hoard resources. Production and distribution is for the good of society. And things are not produced for their exchange value, i.e., there was a good definition of this in episode 12, but they're produced for their use value. So what does that actually mean? Well, I'm about to tell you. I talk about this in episode 12. I'm just going to look at the, bullet point notes that I have here. Basically, okay, well, there's no definition of that in the notes, which is really fucking helpful. But basically, the whole point in communism and socialism is that things are made not for their value on the market, but they are made for their value to human beings. They are made for their usefulness to be used, rather than their ability to be exchanged for things. That's this idea of use value versus exchange value. And the whole point of all of this, the whole point of socialism and communism, is for the full development of the individual. It's to allow an individual to not have to just work to survive, but work to find fulfillment, to do what they want to do, to enjoy their life. And you might say that's unrealistic. It's not my job to refute that, but that's just the aim behind all of this. It's made to allow individuals to basically just do what they want. Now, unlike socialism, communism cannot be done with a market economy. Now, what is a market economy? A market, and I mentioned this term earlier, is just a resource allocation mechanism. A market is basically a way of determining which resources go to where. So in a market economy, the decisions about what gets produced and how what gets produced gets distributed to people. So what gets made and who gets what, and the kind of economic rules are made not by this coordinated economic state agency or democratic agency, but mostly by individuals or by companies. And they are made according to the economic rules of supply and demand. So things get produced, things get given to people based on the rules of supply and demand. That is what a market economy is. And markets are something that are classically seen in capitalism. So capitalism, by definition, involves markets. But in socialism, you can actually have markets as well. So market socialism is in fact a thing. But in communism, markets cannot be a thing. So market economies are not compatible with communism. The resource allocation mechanism in communist societies has to be planning. Now, what is planning? Planning is when the state, or rather local bodies, local democratic bodies, or just local non-democratic bodies, by the way, it doesn't have to be democratic, the state as central authority or local bodies, i.e. local authority, are used to encourage development and growth in the economy, i.e. to make these decisions about what gets made and who gets what gets made. That these decisions are made not according to the rules of supply and demand, but they are used to encourage development and growth in the economy to accomplish some kind of state goal. For example, that state goal could be greater national wealth. Now, planning is something that is also compatible with capitalism, and we talk about it in episode 11. It's also commonly a feature of socialism. So socialism classically involves planning. Some forms of socialism may not involve planning, but most of the time socialism involves planning. In communism, communist economies involve planning by definition. But there's different kinds of planning. So planning can be centralized or decentralized. So in centralized planning or central planning, the state apparatus, the state, decide what gets made, how it gets made, where it gets made, how that stuff gets distributed, and what you might call prices, i.e. the value of what gets made. And the aim is for the economy to serve the goals of the state rather than serving private interest. So all these decisions are made top down. Local units obey this directive. Now, central planning was seen in, for example, the Soviet Union and also their satellite states. In practice, some economists say that the USSR wasn't a good example of central planning, but was rather a command economy, where local units kind of modified this plan to serve a general government purpose. The point is that centralized planning does not have to be democratic. It can be democratic, And in fact, it's not theoretically incompatible with democracy. You could say that in a communist state, you could have central planning, wherein the state apparatus's purpose shifts from political rule to economic administration. In practice, whenever central planning has been implemented, it's always been in an authoritarian and anti-democratic context. And it kind of makes sense because when you give the state that kind of power, that's a huge amount of power to give a state apparatus. And one of the key lessons to take away from history is that if you're giving, in politics, in political theory, political science, in organizing the institutions of a country, if you're giving a group of people power, you need to have checks and balances. Otherwise that power will be abused. And if you give someone control over the whole economy, that's a lot of power to give someone. There's also the fact that that's also quite an authoritarian thing. Because if you have no input directly in how things get made, that's power. You don't have the power to do that. That's a loss in your political power as an individual. So right now, you have the power to start a business and make stuff. But in a centralized economy, you don't have the power to do that. You're told what to do and you do it. Now, if the state itself is democratic, then this could kind of be described as just like the will of the society as a whole. But again, in all contexts in which centralized planning has been tried, it hasn't been in a centralized context. Now, in decentralized planning, rather than the state apparatus making these decisions, the economy is comprised of these horizontal units, these autonomous, self-regulating economic units. And these units could be, for example, as often formulated in socialist theories, workers' councils, so groups of workers working in a factory or some kind of economic unit who make their own decisions about what gets made and how that gets distributed. And the key thing is that you have all these units. They each have their own mechanisms for making decisions and for investing resources and allocating resources. And none of these units are stronger than the other. The economy is arranged horizontally. And there may be a nationwide plan. There may be coordination between these units, but each unit is autonomous and democratically governed. That's the key. Each unit it's governed by the people working in that unit. There's lots of ways of doing this. So workers' cooperatives, for example, workers' councils, councils of workers and consumers, or trade unions, etc., etc., etc. This is more democratic, and it's actually advocated by lots of different schools of socialist thought, lots of different schools of communist thought, and also it's advocated by anarchist thought. More and more anarchism is in the next episode of this special. The point is, decentralized planning is in a lot of schools of thought. Another point to be made is that socialism, communism are big umbrella terms, and some forms of socialism support market socialism. Some involve a mix of markets and planning. Some forms of socialism support decentralized planning. Some support centralized planning. In communism, you can have either decentralized or centralized planning, or maybe a bit of both. Now, in true communism, in the political science definition of communism, regardless of the form of planning, the aim is the same: to create a free, democratic, equal society of individuals. In practice, centralized planning, it may not actually be possible to achieve that end with centralized planning. So all these different interpretations of communism, legitimate interpretations of communism, I should say, have the same end but disagree on the means. So communism, now in terms of how the economy would actually be run in a communist society, Marx didn't really say much about this. What Marx did say was that the state would wither away in a communist society. So presumably, the form of planning would have to be decentralized. If the state is withered away, there's no central unit to synchronize planning. So presumably it would have to be decentralized. And also, Marx constantly went on about democracy. Karl Marx genuinely supported democracy. He always imagined a communist society as being established by a bottom-up process, by the people as a whole taking power and giving power to the people. So presumably, Marx would have backed decentralized planning, but he didn't really talk about it. Marx, again, a big difficulty of these communist politicians in the 1900s who did actually manage to establish communist states was that Marx didn't really say how all this would actually, he didn't really talk about the nuts and bolts of all this. Hence, there is a large net of how you can interpret Marxism. Also, hence, there's lots of illegitimate interpretations and lots of bastardizations of Marxism, as we see in the Soviet Union, for example, where the USSR could maybe be called Marxist because they did actually share his theoretical analysis of history, but in practice, they would have hated Karl Marx had he existed in their time, and Marx would have hated them. But all forms of communism on that economic axis of economic left versus economic right would be at the far pole of economic left. So planning is the furthest left form, the far left pole on that economic spectrum. The question is whether central planning is the absolute furthest left form of running the economy, or whether decentralized planning is the absolute furthest left pole of that axis. Because, as I said earlier, economic leftism is basically about how much control the state has over the economy. So that would imply that central planning is at the far left of that pole. But, so in the Russian Revolution and in the aftermath of the Russian Revolution, the Bolsheviks took power, but there were lots of people in Russia who opposed what the Bolsheviks were doing, who opposed their consolidation of power, who imposed the centralization of the state, who imposed this consolidation of bureaucracy and one-party rule, as opposed to the people as a whole sharing power. And these dissidents were known as left communists. So if you Google search left communism, you basically see communists who, in the 1900s, defined themselves as left of the Bolsheviks, who saw themselves as who opposed the kind of top-down, heavy-handed consolidation of power and imposition of order on society by the Bolshevik Party, and instead favored a bottom-up approach where the people as a whole were in charge of society and the people ran society democratically. And these oppositions were known as left communists. They defined themselves as left of the political spectrum to the Bolsheviks. So that would, because what these people advocated was decentralized planning. They argued that the central planning of the Soviet Union was too authoritarian, it was too bureaucratic, and they wanted a form of running the economy that brought power into the hands of the people. And so they call themselves left communists, which would imply that decentralized planning is left of centralized planning. I think when it comes to defining economic leftism, we could define economic leftism as the state having a greater hand in the economy, but we could also, I guess, define it as the people or society as a whole having a greater hand in running the economy. So it's not necessarily the case that it has to be the state being the controlling actor here. So you could argue that decentralized planning is the most economically leftist form of running the economy. This is probably something that personally I would argue, especially as anarchism, which is the most left-wing political ideology out there, and the most economically left-wing ideology out there, and the most progressive and the most libertarian ideology out there, consistently advocates for decentralized planning. So I would put decentralized planning at the far left of that political spectrum, but there is debate about that. Now, let's look at another God, we've done this for an hour. We're not even nearly done, man. If this voice recording loses this recording, I'm going to be livid. I'm going to be furious. In fact, what I might do actually is just stop it here and then immediately start re-recording and then just stitch those MP3s together. Because if I lose an hour of talking and progress, I'm not going to be, can you imagine how devastating that would be? Yes, I'm going to save this now because I don't trust technology. And if this deletes itself, I'm going to be devastated. So give me a moment.